Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World. The show that peels back the spreadsheets and finds the story, the drama, and sometimes, the sheer absurdity behind the numbers that run our lives. Today, we're heading to the UK, a land of tea, queuing, and apparently, a very, very stubborn inflation problem. It's November 6, 2025. Picture the scene: the leaves are turning, the nights are drawing in, and the nation's Chancellor, Labour's Rachel Reeves, is getting ready to play the highest stakes game of economic Jenga in recent memory. Her big day is November 26, when she delivers the Autumn Statement, which is basically the UK's mid-season financial report card. And folks, the stakes couldn't be higher. Reeves is standing on a tightrope. On one side, she has to plug a government budget black hole of a whopping £35 billion. That means tax hikes and spending cuts, the kind of stuff that makes economies sleepy. On the other side, she and her boss, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, have screamed from the rooftops that their number one, top of the list, do-or-die mission is, say it with me, growth. It's a classic paradox. How do you take money out of the economy to fix your books while also trying to get the economy to grow? It's like trying to lose weight by eating more cake. But wait, there's another monster in the room. A dragon she helped create. Its name is inflation. And taming this beast has become her immediate, all-consuming obsession. Why? Because if she can pull it off, the prize isn't just a pat on the back. It's the key that could unlock the entire UK economy. So today, we're going to unpack Rachel Reeves's grand, audacious, and frankly, risky plan to wrestle inflation to the ground. Is she a genius about to pull off an economic masterstroke, or is this just a desperate gamble? Let's dig in. To understand what Reeves is trying to do now, we first have to travel back in time. Not far, just to October 2024. Fresh off their election win, the new Labour government was eager to make its mark. Reeves, as the new Chancellor, delivered a budget with some well-intentioned policies. She announced a £26 billion payroll tax rise to fund public services and pushed through significant minimum wage hikes. On the surface, who can argue with that? More money for nurses and teachers, and a bigger paycheck for the lowest paid workers. Sounds great, right? A real people-first budget. The problem is, economics has this pesky little thing called unintended consequences. Imagine you run a chain of coffee shops. The government suddenly tells you that your tax bill for every employee is going up, and you have to pay your baristas more. You're a business owner, not a charity. What do? You don't just sigh and accept lower profits. No, you look at your menu, and that £3.50 flat white suddenly becomes a £3.80 flat white. Now, multiply that logic by every single business in the country. From supermarkets and hairdressers to factories and logistics firms. They all faced higher costs, and they all did the same thing: they passed those costs on to you, the consumer. And boom. That's a big part of why, 1 year later, the UK is staring at an inflation rate of 3.8%. Now, that might not sound as terrifying as the near 10% peaks we saw a few years ago, but it's still almost double the Bank of England's 2% target. For context, that means the cost of living is still getting painfully more expensive every month, just a bit slower than it was before. Food inflation is even higher, running at a chunky 4.3%. Your weekly shop is still a source of weekly pain. The Bank of England, the UK's grumpy financial guardians, noticed. They've been holding interest rates at a restrictive 4%, making mortgages and business loans expensive, precisely to cool this inflation down. And they've been pointing a not-so-subtle finger at the government. In a report back in August, the bank's wizards explicitly said that government-regulated price hikes, things like water bills, energy price caps, and car taxes, had added a whopping 0.6 percentage points to the headline inflation rate. In the polite, coded language of central banking, that's the equivalent of screaming, "Hey, government, you're not helping." So, as one analyst, Simon French at Panmure Liberum, put it, Reeves's new inflation-busting crusade is basically a clear confession that this was a policy failure. She's essentially trying to clean up her own mess. The question is, how? So, if your first attempt to fix the economy inadvertently made things worse, you don't just try the same thing again. You get clever. You get surgical. Rachel Reeves is now opening up her Chancellor's toolkit to find levers that can directly and mechanically pull down that official inflation number. This is a fascinating strategy. It's part economic management, part clever accounting, and part public relations. Let's look at the main tools she's considering. Tool number 1, the energy bill scalpel. Energy bills are the monster under everyone's bed. They've come down from their terrifying peaks, but they're still high. Reeves knows that if you can lower energy bills, you don't just help households, you also get a direct, measurable hit on the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is the official scorecard for inflation. So, what's the plan? First, there's talk of scrapping the 5% value-added tax, VAT, on domestic energy bills. This is a popular idea. It's simple, direct, and feels fair. Economists at Pantheon Macroeconomics estimate this single move would shave 0.16 percentage points off the CPI. It's not a game changer on its own, but it's a solid start. The political downside? It gives a bigger cash saving to wealthy people in large, energy-guzzling homes than it does to a pensioner in a one-bedroom flat. But politically, it's an easy win. Second, and this one is a bit more inside baseball, is to move the so-called green and social levies off of energy bills. Right now, a chunk of your electricity bill isn't for electricity at all, it's a tax to pay for renewable energy projects and social programs. The idea is to move these charges, worth about £3.5 billion, off your bill and pay for them through general taxation instead. The Resolution Foundation, a top UK think tank, calculates this move could knock another 0.3 percentage points off CPI. Combine that with the VAT cut, and you're looking at a potential reduction of nearly half a percentage point in headline inflation, just from tinkering with energy bills. That's a huge, direct impact. Tool number 2, the regulated price wrench. This is where things get really nerdy, but also really powerful. A huge number of prices in the UK aren't set by the free market, they're set by the government, or regulated by it, and they often go up each year based on an inflation formula. Things like train tickets and student loans. For years, many of these have been linked to an old, wonky measure of inflation called the Retail Price Index, or RPI. Think of RPI as your grandpa's old, stretched-out tape measure. It generally reads higher than the more modern, internationally recognized measure, CPI. The difference can be almost a full percentage point. Reeves is looking to switch these formulas. For example, by changing the annual train fare increase from being linked to RPI to being linked to CPI, she can make the price hike smaller. Passengers are happier, and the official inflation number gets a little bit of downward pressure. The cost is pushed onto the rail operators, but wait, the government is in the process of bringing them back into public ownership anyway. So, it's essentially the left pocket paying the right pocket. They're doing the same with university tuition fees and even renewable energy tariffs. It's a quiet, technical, but effective way of stopping government policy from actively pushing inflation up. Tool number 3, the fuel duty freeze ray. Fuel duty. The single most politically sensitive tax in the United Kingdom. For 14 years straight, governments of all stripes have been terrified to raise it. Technically, it's supposed to go up every year with inflation, and a temporary 5 pence per litre cut from the pandemic era is also supposed to end. If Reeves let both of those things happen, petrol prices would jump overnight. It would be political suicide and would add nearly 0.2 percentage points to the inflation rate. So, the obvious move is to freeze the duty again. The problem? It's expensive. The Resolution Foundation says this move alone would cost the Treasury £5 billion a year. That's £5 billion she needs to find to plug the giant fiscal hole. This is the perfect example of the Chancellor's dilemma. Do you take the popular, anti-inflationary path that costs a fortune, or do you take the fiscally responsible path that angers every driver in the country and makes your inflation problem worse? My money's on the freeze ray. Tool number 4, the high street shield. Finally, there's food inflation. Here, the approach is more indirect. Reeves can't just tell Tesco to cut the price of bread. But she can influence their costs. This brings us back to the mess from her 2024 budget. She's now signaling a major reform of business rates, a property tax for commercial buildings. For years, brick-and-mortar retailers on the high street have complained that they pay huge rates, while giant online retailers like Amazon pay comparatively little for their massive out-of-town warehouses. Reeves is proposing to shift that burden. Lower the tax on the high street shops and physical supermarkets, and increase it on the online warehouses. The theory is simple: if you lower a supermarket's tax bill, they have less pressure to raise the price of your groceries. It's an attempt to reverse the damage from last year, fighting food inflation by proxy. So, let's add it all up. Reeves is trying to use a series of technical adjustments on energy, rail, and fuel to mechanically pull down the headline inflation number. If all these measures are implemented, economists believe she could actively lower CPI by as much as 0.5 percentage points. That's enough, they hope, to get inflation back to the 2% target by the second half of next year. And this is where we get to the prize. The whole point of this elaborate exercise is to send a giant, flashing neon sign to the Bank of England that says, the government has got this. You can start cutting interest rates now. If the bank believes her, the reward is immense. A cut in interest rates from 4% would be a shot of adrenaline for the UK's sluggish economy. Mortgages would get cheaper for millions of homeowners, breathing life into the housing market. Businesses could borrow more cheaply to invest and expand. It could create the very cyclical upswing and growth that Starmer and Reeves have been dreaming of. And here's the kicker, it helps her with her other massive problem, the £35 billion budget hole. The government is the UK's biggest borrower. If interest rates fall, the interest payments on its mountain of debt also fall. The government's own watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, had penciled in a long-term interest rate of around 3.8%. If Reeves's plan works and rates are cut to, say, 3% by 2026, the ready reckoners show she could save around £10 billion a year in borrowing costs. That's £10 billion she doesn't have to find through painful tax rises or spending cuts. It's a beautiful, virtuous cycle. A political and economic masterstroke. But. And in economics, there's always a but. This is a high-wire act. Remember that £35 billion hole? She still has to fill most of it. That will require major, painful tax increases and spending cuts somewhere else in the budget. And those measures are, by their very nature, deflationary and bad for growth. They suck demand out of the economy. So, she's effectively hitting the brakes and the accelerator at the same time. She's hoping her targeted, inflation-reducing tricks will create enough confidence and room for interest rate cuts to more than offset the drag from her other budget balancing measures. Will it work? The jury is out. Simon French, the analyst we mentioned earlier, remains unconvinced. He sees the prize but questions her ability to thread the needle so perfectly. The risk is that the tax hikes and spending cuts bite harder than expected, stifling growth and pushing the fragile economy towards a recession, while the inflation-fighting tricks are seen as just that, tricks that don't address the underlying wage pressures and supply chain issues. So, what we're watching here is a fascinating piece of economic statecraft. Rachel Reeves is in a political and economic corner, largely of her own party's making. Her 2024 budget, designed to be popular, backfired and stoked the inflation she now has to fight. Her new plan is an audacious pivot. Instead of using the broadsword of economy-wide tax hikes, she's using a surgeon's scalpel and an accountant's pen. She's trying to engineer a specific outcome, a lower headline inflation number, to persuade the Bank of England to give her the ultimate prize, lower interest rates. This isn't just about the numbers. It's about psychology. If she can convince businesses, markets, and the public that the government is serious and that inflation is truly on a downward path, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Workers might moderate their wage demands, and businesses might think twice before hiking prices. Ultimately, this is one of the boldest budget strategies we've seen in years. It's a high-risk, high-reward gamble. If she gets it right, she could be hailed as the Chancellor who tamed inflation, unlocked growth, and set the UK on a path to recovery, banking a £10 billion bonus for the Treasury in the process. But if she gets it wrong, if the balancing act fails and the economy tips into recession while inflation remains sticky, she'll be seen as the Chancellor who tried to get fancy with the numbers while the fundamentals of the economy crumbled. On November 26, we'll see which block she decides to pull from that Jenga tower. Will she be the master of the game, or will it all come crashing down? We will be watching very, very closely. That's all for today. Stay savvy.